Kevin Sullivan, the wrestler, booker, creative genius in many ways, passed away this morning. I wanted to do a video sort of giving my memories and thoughts of Kevin Sullivan throughout the years because I may have a different perspective than some other people. First of all, Kevin Sullivan was a legitimate wrestling legend, especially where I mostly grew up. I grew up in Tampa, and growing up in Tampa, all you hear about from the old timers is the Armory, the infamous Armory, championship wrestling from Florida every Tuesday, hosted by Gordon Soley, and these wonderful memories that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of all these great wrestling legends like the Briscoes, Dusty Rhodes, Pac Song, all these guys. And the name that comes up all the time is Kevin Sullivan, El Diablo. I heard so many stories about Kevin Sullivan. You want to talk about the era of kayfabe. A lot of the old timers I grew up around, who had lived in Tampa far longer, since way before I was alive, all remember Kevin Sullivan. There's people now who are much older than I am who have fond memories of Kevin Sullivan. And the one thing I heard about Kevin Sullivan from all these other guys is that he was evil. He was an evil, evil bad guy. His gimmick, even though they didn't say that he was a satanic worshiper, it was never actually said on TV, to my knowledge, that he worshiped Satan. The gimmick was that he was El Diablo. He was a vindictive guy. He was an evil character because he was a great heel. And what I hear from a lot of people is that people back then believed that wrestling was real, and they really thought this guy worshiped Satan. And that obviously led to a lot of very interesting altercations outside of the wrestling ring. When I got to see Kevin Sullivan wrestle, it would have been in WCW in the early 90s. And at that point, he was long past, his peak years in championship wrestling from Florida. At this point, he was an older guy, and his matches were never all that crazy, but he was somebody who I got to know as being the arch nemesis of Hulk Hogan for several years, including with the infamous Dungeon of Doom angle. And then after that, Kevin Sullivan got into a vicious feud with Chris Benoit. Now, what I find interesting about the feud with Chris Benoit is it was life imitating art or art imitating life, because Kevin Sullivan booked a story where his real life wife, woman, aka Nancy, kind of had an affair with him, with Chris Benoit. And then what ends up happening is Nancy actually gets with Chris Benoit and ends up marrying him. And, well, the less said about 2007, the better. But you know what her fate was. It's unfortunate. But that was the first time I can remember ever really hearing a story. And it's not the first time ever, but it's certainly the first time in my lifetime ever hearing a situation where a pro wrestling fantasy storyline actually bled into real life, because she really did leave him for Chris. And the joke for years was that Kevin Sullivan booked his own divorce. Now, we don't know about their personal life. There's obviously been things out there that have been said, but he's a guy who I think really became known as that in later years of wrestling, like past like the Armory era, but he'll always be remembered as one of wrestling's great villains. He's a great heel. I knew him from the Varsity Club as well during that era. Like, I missed the Diablo era because I was too little for that, or I wasn't even born really for most of it. But the one thing I got to learn about Kevin Sullivan was listening to his interviews with guys like Sean Oliver, HighSpots.com, Rob Feinstein, whatever, all these interviews that he did talking about him as a booker and like peering into his wrestling mind. And even though he spoke very softly, very slowly, it's always interesting to me to listen to the minds of wrestling bookers and to learn from them and to learn how their creative process works. And he was obviously a student of Eddie Graham, again, Tampa legend Eddie Graham, who was, considered one of the all-time greatest bookers ever, who taught a lot of guys like Dusty Rhodes and even Bill Watts some of the techniques of booking wrestling, of being a storyteller. And Kevin Sullivan was always somebody who was really fun to listen to, because he would always, his perspective always came from the point of respect for what we do, but also respect for the audience. Even he knew that some of the shit that he got into was not the best. I'm sure he knew that the Dungeon of Doom angle was bad. I'm sure he knew that. He had to have known. But the reality is, no booker is perfect. And even like Triple H, who's been getting a lot of praise lately, there are a few missteps from Triple H. He has not been a perfect booker. He has done some things that I haven't liked. He's better than Vince, but he's made some mistakes. I think you have to make mistakes and then learn from them. But he was always a pleasure to listen to. And if you haven't listened to one of his interviews and you really want to learn about the history of wrestling, I would totally tell you to go check out any one of his shoot interviews, because you will learn a lot. So that's my video for today. Kevin Sullivan, rest in peace. I was originally going to upload a video about why there's too many belts in wrestling, but I think I'll hold off until Sunday for that and instead just give you my tribute video today, paying respects to a guy who became famous not only in my backyard, but in many backyards throughout the years, not literally, but all over the country, and a guy who's revered in this city and who people need to remember. Those are my thoughts. Remember to tell those in your life that you love them, because you never know when their last day on earth might be. Take care of yourself and each other.